Let me tell you something about the phrase thinking too much. It is one of the most commonly used pieces of advice in the English language. Stop overthinking. You are in your head again. Just switch off. Stop analyzing everything. You think too much. And if you are a deep thinker, if your mind has never quite operated at the pace and the depth that the people around you seem comfortable with, you have probably heard some version of this your entire life. From parents, from partners, from friends who genuinely care about you and cannot understand why you cannot just let something go. Why a conversation from 3 days ago is still being processed. Why a decision that should take 5 minutes is taking 5 days. Why you cannot watch a film without analyzing it or have a conversation without finding the layer underneath the layer. Here is what nobody who says stop overthinking has ever told you. The psychology research does not find that deep thinkers think too much. It finds that they think differently, at a depth, and with a quality of processing that is not a malfunction of ordinary cognition. It is a specific and identifiable cognitive profile with specific neurological foundations, specific developmental origins, and specific consequences. Some of them difficult, some of them representing some of the rarest and most valuable cognitive qualities the human mind produces. And the reason most deep thinkers spend so much of their lives at war with their own minds is not because the depth is the enemy. It is because nobody ever gave them a map. Let's start with what is actually happening neurologically, because this is the foundational piece that reframes everything else. The brain of the deep thinker is not running the same program as the brain that processes information at the surface level and moves on. The neuroimaging research is specific about this. The default mode network, the system of brain regions that activates during mind wandering, during reflection, during the generation of internal narrative, shows significantly higher baseline activity in individuals who score high on measures of reflective thinking and depth of processing. Marcus Reichel's foundational neuroimaging research at Washington University mapped this network first. The subsequent work by Randy Buckner and colleagues connected it directly to the quality of internal mental life, to the richness of associative thinking, to the capacity for insight, to the kind of thinking that does not happen in focused external attention, but in the continuous internal processing that most people never access at this depth. The deep thinker's brain is not running inefficiently. It is running continuously. The default mode network that in most people quiets when external attention is demanded stays active in the deep thinker even when they are doing something else. The processing does not pause because the external situation has moved on. This is why the deep thinker is still thinking about the conversation when the conversation is over, still processing the experience when everyone else has filed it and moved on, still finding the implications of something that happened last week because the processing did not complete last week. And the brain does not file things that are not yet complete. Now let me talk about what that continuous processing is actually doing, because this is the piece that the stop overthinking advice most completely misses. The research on unconscious thought theory, developed by Abe Dijkster-Huys at the University of Amsterdam, found something that directly challenges the assumption that more thinking is always worse thinking. For complex problems, problems with multiple variables, multiple stakeholders, multiple possible outcomes, unconscious processing outperforms conscious deliberation. The mind working below the threshold of awareness, integrating information without the bandwidth limitations of conscious attention, generates better solutions to complex problems than the mind trying to consciously work through the same complexity. The deep thinker is not running a flawed version of the program that everyone else is running. They are running a more thorough version, one that refuses to accept surface-level analysis as sufficient when the problem is genuinely complex, one that keeps processing because the processing is not yet complete, not because something is wrong, because something important is still being worked on. The insight that arrives in the shower, the solution that appears from nowhere after days of apparent non-resolution, is not magic. It is the unconscious processing of the deep thinker completing work that the conscious mind could not finish faster. And the research is consistent. That completion, when it arrives, produces better outcomes than the quick conclusion that shallower processing generates. Here is the finding that most deep thinkers have never heard framed in a way that changes how they understand themselves. The research on integrative complexity, the capacity to consider multiple dimensions of an issue simultaneously and to integrate those dimensions into a coherent but genuinely complex understanding, identifies this as one of the most consequential cognitive variables in the psychology of high achievement. Peter Sudfeld and Philip Tetlock's research on integrative complexity found that it was associated with better long-term decision-making, with greater ability to navigate genuinely ambiguous situations, and with the kind of thinking that produces novel solutions to problems that simpler cognitive approaches cannot reach. The deep thinker does not see one dimension of a problem. They see several simultaneously. They see the exception to the rule, the implication of the implication, the way that the solution to this problem creates the conditions for a different problem downstream. This is high integrative complexity operating on problems that genuinely warrant it. And the research is clear. The person who can hold multiple dimensions of genuine complexity in mind simultaneously and integrate those dimensions into a response that accounts for all of them is not thinking too much. They are thinking at the level the problem actually requires. Let me talk about the emotional dimension, because the research on deep thinking and emotional experience is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of this profile. The same depth of processing that the deep thinker applies to ideas and problems and the external world they apply with equal thoroughness to their own emotional experience. The emotional event that most people process quickly and file away. The conversation that felt slightly off, the interaction that left an unidentifiable residue, the experience that was fine on the surface but somehow is not finished. The deep thinker processes at a depth and across a duration that their environment rarely has patience for. Lisa Feldman Barrett's research on emotional granularity, the precision with which people can identify and distinguish between specific emotional states, finds that high granularity individuals experience their emotional lives with a resolution that most people never access. They are not feeling more than other people in the simple quantitative sense. They are feeling with more precision, more differentiation, more information available from the emotional experience. And the research on what this produces is important. Barrett's work found that higher emotional granularity was associated with better emotional regulation, better interpersonal functioning, and greater resilience. Not more emotional fragility, more emotional sophistication. The deep thinker who is told they are too sensitive, too affected, too slow to move on from emotional experience is being told, in effect, that their emotional intelligence is a liability. The research says the opposite. It is one of the most powerful cognitive resources available to the human mind when it has the framework to use it as information rather than being overwhelmed by it as sensation. Here is the one that I think lands hardest, and the one that most deep thinkers carry without ever having it named. The experience of being fundamentally alone with the depth of what they think and feel. Not alone in the social sense necessarily. The deep thinker can be surrounded by people who care about them genuinely and still experience a specific and persistent loneliness that is not about the presence or absence of other people. It is about the gap between the depth of their inner world and what the social environment can receive of it. The deep thinker has thoughts that are not welcome in most conversations, not because the thoughts are wrong or antisocial, because they move at a pace and to a depth that most social environments are not structured to accommodate. Because the conversation that the deep thinker wants to have, that goes somewhere, that follows the implication to its conclusion, that is willing to sit with the uncomfortable thing rather than move to something easier, is not the conversation that most people are equipped or inclined to have on any given Tuesday evening. William Graziano's research on social motivation and relationship quality found that individuals who are more selective in their social engagement, who choose fewer, deeper connections over broader, shallower ones, report higher relationship satisfaction and stronger feelings of being genuinely known. The deep thinker who accepts that genuine connection for them requires depth is not being antisocial. They are being accurate about what their psychology actually requires. The loneliness is real, and it is the loneliness not of someone who cannot connect, but of someone whose connection requirements are more specific than the average social environment can readily provide. Let me talk about the cost side honestly, because a complete picture requires it. The deep thinker's continuous processing does not always produce insight. Sometimes it produces the specific misery of a mind that cannot leave something alone that deserves to be left alone. That returns to a resolved question and reopens it. That treats a settled matter as unsettled because the settling feels premature. The research on rumination, Susan Nolan Hoeksema's foundational work on repetitive negative thinking as a primary mechanism in depression and anxiety, is relevant here. And the distinction it makes is critical for understanding what separates adaptive deep thinking from maladaptive rumination. Rumination is the repetitive, passive focus on distress and its causes without moving toward resolution or understanding. It returns to the same material, extracts the same conclusions, and generates the same negative affect in an unproductive loop that depletes psychological resources without producing anything that the depletion was worth. Deep thinking, genuine, engaged, generative processing of complex material is cognitively different. It is moving. It is finding. It is making connections that were not previously made and arriving at understanding that was not previously available. The deep thinker who understands this distinction has a tool for distinguishing between the processing that is worth the cognitive cost and the processing that has become a self-perpetuating loop. Not because the distinction is always easy to make, but because having the language for the difference is the beginning of being able to use it. Here is where I want to land. The person who thinks too much is not thinking too much. They are thinking at a depth that the culture around them, its pace, its preference for quick answers, its discomfort with complexity and ambiguity, has consistently pathologized as excess. The neurological reality is a brain that processes more thoroughly. The cognitive reality is integrative complexity that most environments never require and never develop. The emotional reality is a granularity of inner experience that is one of the most sophisticated resources the human mind can possess. The relational reality is a requirement for genuine depth that most social environments cannot easily satisfy. All of it costly, all of it real, and all of it. The cost and the capacity together, the expression of a cognitive profile that is not broken. It is running at a level of depth that the world around it has rarely known what to do with. That is not a failing of the profile. It is a failing of the map. You now have more of the map than you did 10 minutes ago. And the mind that never fully switches off already knows what to do with it.